Welcome again, everybody. This is only the second BioYUFE webinar, this time on research networks. And we've got 1.5 hours planned for that. The aim is to finish within the hour, but just in case we need to run a little bit longer, we've got a bit of a buffer there. We've got Matthew Nielsen with us already. You can see him on screen. He's from the University of Bremen in Germany. And you also have his contact details down there. He's probably, he's going to kick off the webinar with talking about the area on continental scale comparative research within the YUFE Alliance, question marks, or, you know, he's raising the question of, do we need this? Do we want to do this strategically as part of the YUFE Alliance? What is it that we can do across the different countries that we're working on? And then Martin Wilkes from the University of Essex is going to join us later. He is teaching in parallel at the moment. He may be listening in already, I'm not quite sure. But he will definitely join us then after Matthew's brief presentation with another brief presentation, probably 15, 20 minutes or so. That should give us a good 20 minutes, hopefully, towards the end where we can have some discussion and everybody can raise some questions as well. I should point out that this webinar is recorded, and the recording of this will ultimately go onto this YouTube link here. That's the YUFE Alliance channel, I guess it's called. And I would like to encourage you all to ask questions live. You could just open your microphone if there are any urgent questions, or put something into the chat, and Bruno and I will try to monitor this. These webinars, they are organized by myself, Michael Steinke. I'm at the University of Essex in Great Britain, and Christine Law at the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle in France. And I also have a bit of an advert here for the next BioYUFE webinar, which is on interdisciplinarity. And we have some guest speakers from France and Belgium, Liliane Campos and Bruno Hoste, who will guide us through the topic of interdisciplinarity on the 3rd of June, same time, 16 to 17:30 Central European time. And then we also plan another last webinar in this series, in this first series, on decolonizing research, which is likely going to happen in autumn. The exact date isn't fixed yet. If you've got any suggestions, I wouldn't mind if you would email with some ideas of what you would like to see covered. So, you know, a question to the audience right away. Get involved and make some suggestions. You know, who is it that we could invite? We have a few ideas already, but it would be good to just hear a little bit more from the community of what we could cover there. Okay, without much further ado, I would say that we open the floor to Matthew then. And I know that Matthew has a presentation prepared, so if you want to share that, and then we can kick off.
Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen just fine now. Yeah, thank you for the invitation to talk today. I'm going to be talking about the potential for BioYUFE in particular, sort of the importance of studying ecology at a continental scale, and the potential of BioYUFE as a resource in this regard. And when we look at this, so, you know, here I have a nice map of YUFE. This is kind of the YUFE map. And one of the things that's most obvious about it, and arguably one of the reasons why it exists, is because it spans Europe. We have universities from Finland in the north, all the way to Spain, and even further in the south. So we have a wide range of, we have universities that are all across Europe. And when we think from an ecological perspective, this map of Europe that I'm showing you has all these different universities, but it also has a lot of other things going on. So for example, if we think about abiotic aspects of the environment, we have a huge amount of climate variation across Europe. That's kind of trivial, but it's true. We also have lots of variation in precipitation, which is not quite so north and south aligned, but it's still something that varies a lot in space. And when we're thinking about ecology, it's really kind of everything is varying across Europe. So we have all sorts of different classical habitats that are found varying across Europe. We have an association that we also have huge variation in biodiversity across Europe. So this map here is just showing, for example, amphibian species richness. You could do this for any species. So when we look across Europe, we see a really wide variation in both the abiotic and biotic factors that we think about when we talk about ecology. And arguably, explaining this variation is kind of the fundamental goal of ecology. When we talk about what is ecology, a lot of it identifies on sort of what species live where, and that where is what we're thinking about when we think about space, and especially at these scales, on these sort of bigger continental, or at least as a proxy for global scales. That's a lot of what we really fundamentally want to explain. We want to figure out how we can say, for example, go from precipitation patterns to diversity of amphibians, or any other sort of relationship among these variables, but we want to know what is driving this spatial variation across the world ultimately. But Europe can be a pretty good proxy for that, for thinking about this on a really big scale. And this is important not just from the perspective of us as ecologists wanting to understand things like just fundamental ecology or conservation. It's also important for a lot of other reasons. As is illustrated by this map, which is showing how the tiger mosquito, one of the species capable of carrying malaria, has been spreading through Europe over time. And this is another thing that, again, to understand this, we need to be thinking on this continental scale. Also, when we're thinking about, for example, spreads of introduced species that might be vectors of diseases or factors like that. So the first kind of point, and I don't think I need to sell this too hard, but it's that if we want to understand ecology, we need to be thinking on these big scales. That's kind of the first point. So that I wanted to make is a very simple one. Everything varies on a continental scale. If we want to understand ecology in the big picture, we need to be thinking about studies on these. Local studies can be very useful and fine. It's a lot of what I do. They're very insightful. But if we want to get at the big picture, we need to conduct big studies. But this is the challenge. So that's kind of what I was saying, is continental scale research is really, really important to ecology. But it has a challenge. And that, well, it's not just one challenge, it has many challenges. Continental scale studies are really hard. The first of these is simply because it's big. Any continent you think of is a big place. And it means if we want to study across the scale, we need to figure out how do we work across a very large spatial area. This takes large amounts of time, it often requires larger sense, and it definitely requires a lot of work to work across such a large spatial extent. If you want to do a nice local field study, that's something you can do. It's easy. If you want to scale it up to across Europe, suddenly you're looking at easily 5 to 10 times the amount of work. These just become very big studies that are often difficult for an individual lab to manage. It's also something that you then, in addition, have to start dealing with. Continental scale studies are highly variable. This is showing temperature, but as I showed you all that maps at the beginning, kind of everything differs with space. And that means that methods, for example, that you developed in one area might not work perfectly in another. There's all sorts of aspects of ecology and other conditions that you need to adjust with if you're thinking about how do we conduct ecological research on a sort of grand climactic scale. And then lastly, these studies are really complicated, and not because just because of the ecology underlying it, but because they become incredibly logistically complicated. How do you manage to actually do things in all these different places at the same time or similar times? And then also, you'll note we have this lovely map of temperature across Europe. You can tell Europe because of, all the outlines and borders, but we can also see all these little lines that are drawn on the map that don't actually mean anything from an ecological perspective, but are country borders. And as soon as you start dealing with that, it adds a lot of bureaucracy that can be actually a major challenge to continental studies. Now, instead of just having to get permits for whatever, sampling you want to do or whatever research you want to do from one country's bureaucratic system, you have to deal with 10 or 5 or however many. So it's another level of complexity that just means that it's really, really, even though these are kind of like the ideal of what we want to achieve as ecologists, they become really, really hard to do so. And so next I'm going to go over several potential approaches that can be taken to achieving sort of ecological insights and goals. The first of these is what I'm going to call it the do-it-yourself approach. It's the approach of taking personal networking and setting out and just saying you want to study across the continent and doing yourself. This map here shows a map of cities that I'm currently planning starting this year to study for urban habitation of butterflies, comparing that across Europe. So part of my own current continental scale research. And the pros of this approach is you get quite high quality data. You have complete control over what's being done. You're looking directly at it. You know exactly what's been done. You get to choose what's been done. You can do it on whatever topic you want. So it has the pros that you get to do exactly what you want and you have full control over it and you know that it's good. It has a lot of cons, most notably because it's labor intensive. It's a lot of work to do this. It's a lot of uncertainty to do this. And it results in a project that's very specialized. You get to answer the question you answer, but you aren't necessarily designing to achieve additional goals for all this work that's being done. It's also something that then becomes hard to transfer. You've done it. You know how to do it. If someone else wants to come along and do something similar, they would have to do all of this almost from scratch. You might be able to give them advice, but you've already built up the networks to do this, figured everything out, and you can't just magically transfer that over to another person. It's potentially temporarily unstable. If you retire, if something happens, you leave academia, this giant project is gone. And of course, as I've already said, the logistics are incredibly complicated. I've definitely been suffering through that the last few weeks, getting going for the first of these sampling trips I'm conducting for this project. It's definitely some of the most complicated research I've ever tried to organize, and yeah. So it's a very powerful approach if you want to do something, but it's also a lot of work. And because of this, people have looked into other approaches. One of the ones that's very popular is working with citizen science and other research databases. So these are things like iNaturalist, or often sometimes at the country level. But importantly, even if you're dealing with country level databases, these are combined through things like GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which integrates data from all sorts of different sampling efforts and species observation programs. And these can be really great for thinking about continental research because they give you data from everywhere. They give you a ton of data. They give you ridiculous amounts of data. And compared to pretty much any other way of getting this data, they're really easy to access. I can just go and search on GBIS for a species I'm interested in, or a species I'm interested in, or a tax I'm interested in, and get a list of thousands of records of where people have observed that species, both from museums, from citizen science. There's tons of data available, but it also has its own problems. As opposed to doing it yourself, where you have high quality, with these databases, the quality can be really unreliable. There's often various forms of error checking and things put into these databases, but it's not always there. And it can be hard to know exactly the quality of data you're getting. And relatedly, they're often subject very heavily to collection biases. People collect more in cities, people collect more in populated areas, people report more in some countries than others. If you look at GBIF, the Netherlands looks like has all the animals in Europe just because there's a lot of people reporting. It's really well integrated. Other countries aren't necessarily so reliably integrated. It's also something that you can only get certain types of data. So like GBIF, for example, it's looking at observations of individuals of different species. So it can give you that kind of data. It doesn't get you the temperature data or the bioclimatic data or phenotypic data on organisms or genetic data. So any of these databases, they're really great resources, but they're usually only giving you a part of the story when you might need multiple sorts of information to combine that. And if you're good with GIS, which I personally am not, you can get around that and start working on this, but it's there. And again, a lot of times also then there's no control to these. It's just kind of what's added. There's no specific, sometimes there's specific methods involved, but usually there aren't. So there can be a variety of methods. And again, it's the kind of thing where you get a lot and that's valuable, but you don't always know what you're getting. So it's definitely quantity over quality. And then the last way that's increasingly emerging, I think, to deal with these continental scale questions is through various forms of research networks. And these come in various flavors. Here I'm specifically highlighting NEON, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. It's a program in the United States, but they come in a variety of flavors. The basic idea is that a bunch of people get together and say, okay, we're working across the continent or a very large spatial scale. We want to do this research. So we're all going to agree to do the same thing in all these different places. This is great because you get to the same high quality potentially as do it yourself. You get to actually do the exact research that you want. And it also has a big advantage of it's shared labor. You don't have to do it all yourself. You can spread it out and you can often gather a lot more data a lot more effectively this way. it has disadvantages in that it's often very specialized. So Neon is going to be an exception, but many of these are made by people who have a common interest in a particular thing, that are going to do and we all agree, okay, this is the question we want to answer, so we're all going to do this thing for a specific thing. So this might be, for example, eddy covariance towers that are measuring gas exchange in different ecosystems. Or right now I'm involved with a starting network that's looking at genomic variation in butterflies across Europe. Sort of population genomics of butterflies in Europe. And so these are often very specialized on a specific question, so they don't have the broad things. And they demand a high level, and the challenge is they demand a high level of coordination. You need to make sure that everyone knows they're doing the same thing. You need to be sure everyone agrees on doing the same thing, and that's a lot of work. They tend to be inflexible, since once you've established what you're doing, you need to stick with it. So they're not, because you're dealing with larger people, it's not a change. And then they're highly funding dependent. Dealing with this many people takes a lot of money. And so they're things that either require some major funding source or otherwise. And Neon is the example I kind of want to highlight because it's maybe one of the most dramatic examples of that. And it takes a lot of money to run. So Neon is a program, the National Environmental Observatory Network, being run by being directly funded by the NSF, the National Science Foundation of the United States, to do, in this case, it's unique it's relatively unique in terms of ecological networks because it's not specialized, it's generalized, to make all sorts of different ecological measurements across the entire United States. So it's a really huge funding that, so it's an exemplary example of this that's generalized, but it shows, but it's also producing a massive amount of data, and it also takes a massive amount of coordination and a massive amount of money to run. So research networks can be really great for making sure, they probably produce the highest quality data with the least effort for one individual, but they do take the effort of a lot of individuals. So those are some different ways that, those are some, I would think some of the major approaches people have taken to trying to understand sort of continental or these large scale ecological patterns. And this brings us back to, YUFE and BioYUFE. And the question is, okay, well, we're spread across Europe. This is that continental scale we want to work on. Can we do anything with this? What can we as YUFE do to maybe facilitate this continental scale research? And I'm going to propose a few suggestions for what we might do, ranging from simplest to most complicated. And there are definitely other possible answers I'll be really happy to discuss with people sort of following this presentation. And the first of this is maybe, I've sort of ranked them from easy to hard. The first of this, though I consider relatively easy, is simply to facilitate access. So we have researchers who are in all different sorts of countries doing ecological research there. As I noted, one of the major barriers to sort of the do-it-yourself approach is often simply logistic and especially bureaucratic barriers. And we can facilitate access for other people in our countries. We might be able to facilitate either understanding the permit process or getting permits or knowing when and where to collect, finding access to field sites. These are all things that we can do for each other that can reduce some of this extreme logistical complexity of DIY approaches. And it has a nice advantage that it's very low cost. It's virtually free. We just need to communicate with each other and have a network where people can ask, hey, some help. And it's relatively low effort. It does take a little bit of effort from the person helping. This should be acknowledged, but it's not, but if you already have understood like the process in your country, note, I'm new to Germany. I don't fully understand the process in Germany, so I can't promise to help yet, but I will hopefully in a year or two be able to. But anyway, the point being, it's still not too much effort, and it reduces at least one of those hurdles. So this is kind of, it's not a big effect, but it's an easy thing we can do. The next level, what's a little bit more work, is looking into forms of direct networking initiatives. So one of the other things that often really helps support these sort of DIY approaches is having a good network, knowing people in different places, studying interesting things to you. The first suggestion doesn't even require that people have the same interest, just that, you know, they can help a little bit, is that there might be ways that we can facilitate networking among each other. And this reduces, again, one of those key forms of labor that can help sort of these more DIY approaches succeed. This can be facilitating new networks, either through, for example, online seminars like this, mailing lists, work groups. I think there's a lot of ways there's a lot of potential ways you can do this, and we can explore that. But the idea is there are probably a variety of things we can do as a network of universities to facilitating networking among our members. And this is something that remains lowish cost, depending on how much we want to invest. You know, there might be ways to actually pay for meetings and things like that that would involve more money, but relatively lowest cost, but a bit more work. Because then instead of just being, oh, someone reaching out to you, it requires someone to do the work to actually try and organize people and make those active connections. But again, for that more effort, I think it will probably be more remote. And then the last example I'm going to bring up is the hard example, and really the extreme example that I'm not even sure is something we should be doing, but it's something we can imagine doing, would be to actually try and within YUFE establish some form of sort of ecological research network. This would actually in some ways have a big benefit over many of the research networks I presented, where they can have these issues with temporal instability, especially relative to DIY research, temporal stability, because we're a whole bunch of universities. YUFE is hopefully here for the longer term, and as long as YUFE is around, it can help support and keep whatever research network going in a longer way, much better than one individual person or even like lab group can do, because it has the potential backings of these institutions. So it could be really good, but this is also something that's going to be really high cost and high effort. It's something where, because as I noted, like this is talking about actually trying to do research collaboratively, which takes money, which takes effort. So this is something that, again, I'm not necessarily saying we should do this, but I think we can think about it. Is there something? And then it's also something that has a really high leadership demand, because it's going to require someone to figure out what's a compelling approach that can actually interest people across all these universities, get the funding online. And that's, again, something that's going to be a lot of work. And then one of the reasons and one of the particular things to think about is that those of us involved in BioYUFE largely aren't doing the same research, we're doing different researchers, which gives us, in some ways, is a challenge to this, because it means we're working from a different paradigm than many research collaborations, where it's just people from different places who do the same thing working together. And it would mean that, and this is part of the reason I wanted to bring up NEON as an example, because there's no way we're going to become NEON. There's no way we can do anything at that scale, but it is an example of a case where a more general purpose research network is being done. Something is being developed with the idea of making data that's usable for a wide range of purposes. And I think if we want to build some sort of research network in YUFE in some way, that might be something you want to keep in mind, is what's a way that we can make it interesting to a wide range of people in YUFE. But again, even if we don't do this scale of research network, even if we all just kind of keep with our own interests, I think there's a lot that can be done by YUFE just to facilitate access and to lower the barriers to these kind of DIY continental scale research approaches. And so, sort of to summarize what I'm saying, the first part of this talk was just reminding you that continental scale patterns are really key to ecology. It's a lot of what we want to understand ultimately when it comes to ecological questions. Why are organisms where they are is one of the oldest ecological questions. And YUFE is continental scale. So if you put those together, it means that it's possible that YUFE should be able to help study these continental scale patterns better than any individual university can. So that's what I have to say, and I look forward to discussing ideas and questions with you.
Great. Thanks very much, Matthew. That was just a perfect introduction to the whole thing, actually, to set the scene. So really well done. Thank you very much for that. I would suggest that we're going straight on to Martin. I can see Martin on the screen already, so I'm very thankful that he's here as well. That's great. Martin, would you be okay to just fire off and go on, and then we can save questions and stuff for later afterwards? Is that okay with you, Martin?
Yes, Michael. It might just be a bit of background noise here. Do you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you fine. There's no problem at all. I don't hear any background at all. And I should say, before we go on, I would start putting a few questions into the chat, and I would, encourage everybody else to just add their views, opinions, or questions into the chat as well, so that we can log them and maybe come back to them later. So, Martin, over to you, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Michael. Can you see my slides? Yeah, I'm using
it's all good.
Strange setup today because I'm actually in the middle of a master's in biotechnology PT lab, so
well done.
multitasking. So I wanted to take the opportunity to talk to you about some of my experiences in research and professional networks. I just have a dozen slides and hopefully some straightforward recommendations kind of rooted in my own experience of working both in academia on collaborative research, but also in industry as well. So first, a bit about me so you can understand my perspective on research networking. So I worked, before I became an academic, I worked in energy and local government. So that was even before I did my first degree. I worked for 18 years in those sectors. I did my bachelor's in environmental science after that, and then following my master's, specializing in river environments. Then my PhD, which was an interdisciplinary project on fluid mechanics and fish ecology. And since then, I was a PI starting in 2015, and I'll talk about my first experience as a PI later. And in terms of my research, or my group attempts to explain and predict how biodiversity will respond to things like warming, pollution, and also conservation management measures. And all of that is really, at the moment in particular, aimed at informing domestic and international nature recovery policy. So I'm sure many of you will be aware of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So these are the kinds of things we're working on in terms of impact. But from my title slide here, you will have noticed these three terms: inter, multi, and transdisciplinary research networks. I think everyone will have a good idea of what interdisciplinarity is, multidisciplinarity, but perhaps not transdisciplinarity. So I wanted to just spend a moment on that. So transdisciplinary research means research that goes beyond disciplinary boundaries. It's been conceptualized as this kind of interaction between science and society, although some people see it as much more radical than this. But definitely part of transdisciplinary research is about reflecting on the role of the self in academic research. And this is something I've learned is especially important when establishing and sustaining research networks and learning how to do that. So I thought it'd be helpful to look at what my experiences have been and try to draw out some kind of general lessons that might be of benefit to others that are embarking on a kind of new research network. So I'm representing here my experiences as kind of circles, because they did involve some kind of learning and adapting on the job, but also by looking back and reflecting on those experiences, this has enabled me to kind of carry forward those lessons from one project to another. So actually, I start with three experiences that predate my academic career, because I think if in industry, we get lots of examples of good practice that I believe academics can learn from, but also some less good practice to avoid. So the first of those experiences, we go all the way back to 1999, was this project with the Government Department for Trade and Industry, as well as the UK energy regulator, Ofgem, and also gas engineers. At the time, the UK government was requiring that the gas distribution companies, of which one I was working for, needed to replace all so-called at-risk cast iron gas mains, those within 30 meters of a property, within 30 years, starting in 2002. So it became known in the industry as the 30 by 30 target, decades before world leaders claimed it for the Global Biodiversity Framework. And my role on the project was as a cartographer, and my team was assigned to establish procedures for digitizing new gas infrastructure in a GIS. And the methods we developed were actually still in use until quite recently. I've got a colleague who still works at the same company. And apparently since 2020, engineers are now using handheld devices to digitize these schemes in the field. But to summarize about this experience and why I thought it was useful to look at this one, it was a great experience for me as a young professional. And, you know, in terms of the success, the scheme is still on track to deliver that 30 by 30 target. But what I learned from this was the importance of regularly sharing physical space as a team, even though you might be out there doing very different tasks. So that will be one of my recommendations at the end. So we'll come back and I'll reflect more generally from these specific experiences. But sharing physical space as a team on a regular basis, whether that's weekly, monthly, that was really important. And as cartographers, we had the opportunity to meet with the engineers on a weekly basis, ask them questions, get to know them. And I think this was instrumental to the early success of this project. The second project I want to mention is one with the Department for Education in the UK, as well as local councillors from the local authority I was working in, and school management teams, as well as IT technicians. So this was about migrating schools to digital student records. During the course of these 3 years, we moved 244 schools in the whole local authority onto new software. And many of these were small schools with a single secretary that had worked at the school for decades, and they had been managing student records on paper with a filing cabinet. So you can imagine the kind of upheaval, the kind of change that this involved for the day-to-day work of these people. And this sort of raises the point that fundamentally, I think all projects, whether in industry or academia, are about changing something, bringing about a change. And the main thing I learned from this project was never to forget about the people who will be most affected by the change that you want to bring about. And in this case, it was kind of an early example of the digital transition, which is often depicted as this kind of clean handover of data. But for some, the process can be extremely stressful and isolating. And the move to digital records for schools was a huge stress to many of the secretaries I worked with. And at least anecdotally, it did lead to the retirement of lots of experienced women, which may ultimately have impacted negatively on the functioning of the schools. So the third project and the final industry project I want to mention was again with the energy regulator Ofgem, a large energy supplier that I was consulting for, and several firms of contractors, plumbers, glazers, insulators. And this was in the build-up to the Energy Companies Obligation 2 or ECO 2 scheme. And this scheme required energy suppliers to install energy-saving measures in customers' homes. Overall, the scheme is thought to have saved about 27 million tons of CO2 in the course of the project. And my role was as a data analyst, and my team was tasked with looking back at the previous energy company's obligation, ECO 1, and I led on the recommendations in terms of improving the quality of reporting that the energy suppliers had to undertake to the regulator. In terms of lessons from the experience, I would start by saying that in my opinion, the scheme wasn't well set up to achieve its objectives. I won't go into detail, but when I confessed this opinion to a senior consultant on the team, he said something I didn't really understand for a long time. He told me, and I quote, "Don't give yourself the luxury of needing to be right." So I listened to this and I scratched my head on and off for a few years. But then actually more recently, when working with policymakers on a completely different project, I realized the importance of compromise in the application of scientific knowledge to policy and to business, if you like, as well. So often in this context, the important thing to say is that being right isn't the main criterion, or it isn't even the most important criterion, okay? So that's the idea of compromising and realizing that policymakers, business owners, they have different priorities to us as scientists. So the first of three academic research projects I want to mention was this Horizon 2020 Research Innovation Staff Exchange project, which I coordinated. It was called Keep Fish, knowledge exchange for efficient passage of fish in the Southern Hemisphere, quite a mouthful. But here we had 8 academic partners from 7 different countries. We had several energy ministries from around the Southern Hemisphere, also the Department of Conservation from several countries, such as New Zealand, Chile, and Argentina, and also hydropower, large hydropower companies that were operating in these countries. And the project aimed to address gaps in our understanding of how hydropower dams, such as the one you see on the slide here, which is one of the ones we worked on, how these dams and other river barriers impact native fish in the Southern Hemisphere, and also how we can mitigate the impacts of hydropower development on these native fisheries. So it was my first PI role, and there were some things that went well. So we had very strong engagement with policymakers and engineers, and also some good papers that we published. We had the top cited article in Aquatic Conservation, Marine and Freshwater Ecosystems in 2020. And we had tangible impact. So we established new design standards for fishways or fish ladders in these countries, so Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Australia, New Zealand. We also had new guidelines that were adopted by energy ministries on sustainable hydropower planning. And also we've got a smartphone app that's used by citizen scientists in New Zealand to record river barriers and to estimate what the potential impact of the barrier would be on the native fishes. I also learned Spanish along the way, which is an important point to come back to in our recommendations at the end. And learning a bit of Spanish really helped with stakeholder engagement. You know, many of the academics that I worked with, they all spoke English, but many of the stakeholders did not. So it really helped to have even just a basic conversational Spanish for the South American work. What went less well, I would say, was a very steep learning curve for me. Again, to understand the different priorities of academics compared to the professions that I've worked in before. And also, to be very honest, to understand the egos of academics and how different they are to the egos of professionals. And in fact, it didn't end great with one partner who blocked publication of a manuscript on the basis that it showed that a method they liked to use was not really that effective. And partly, I think, both the successes and the challenges here were down to the effectiveness or otherwise of the communication across the different disciplines involved. Just as an example of where this went for the biologists on the team here, we published a paper later, which was entitled Beyond Fitting Fish into Equations, which was a bit of a jibe at the engineers who wanted to kind of collapse all biological behavior onto a single kind of simple engineering equation. So this, of course, underlines the need for us to think about how we seek synthesis between very different disciplines, and I'll return to that idea soon. The penultimate project is one that I completed last year and published the results in Nature, Ecology, Evolution. This was a small project, and I think, as Matthew would say, a kind of do-it-yourself kind of networking. It was quite an informal approach to 8 different academic partners from 6 countries around the European Alps, as well as national park managers across the Alps. And in this project, we brought together ecological data from different ecology labs around the Alps with glacier projections to the end of the century. And I'll just show one sort of zoomed in look at the glacier projections. And we use these projections with species distribution modeling to predict the kind of future distribution of specialist cold adapted stream invertebrates. And my role here was as a lead ecological modeler. And this was a type of multidisciplinary project that I would refer to maybe as kind of serial disciplinary project, in that each discipline was doing its thing and then passing over the results to the next discipline and so on. And actually, it was a real headache for the ecologists at first to get the data from the glaciologists and the hydrological modelers in a form that we needed for the ecological modeling. And I think the solution eventually came down to each of us kind of sitting down and saying, okay, we've assumed too much knowledge on the part of the other disciplines about our own discipline. So it was a case of just taking a step back and revisiting our assumptions about what the other disciplines knew about our particular field. And once we overcame that, the project really just flew. And this is one of the recommendations I'll come back to in the final slide. The last experience I wanted to talk about was an ongoing Academy of Medical Sciences project with 12 academic partners from 6 institutions that includes biologists, hydrologists, geomorphologists, and social scientists, as well as people from the hydropower industry again, and government scientists, mainly in Kenya, but also we've got partners in the UK, Colombia, and Indonesia. My role on this project is joint PI along with the Kenyan PI. And we aim to test an environmental DNA and species distribution modeling approach for assessing the health and climate sensitivity of tropical river basins. And the project was set to run until the end of this month, but as I'm sure many of you will have read in the news, we had a particularly severe El Nino event in the last 6 months that made most of our field sites inaccessible since October. So we've just been given an extension by the funder, thankfully. But this example shows that however much we might scrutinize the past, try to learn lessons and put them into practice, sometimes the natural world has other plans and we can't control that. So what kind of general recommendations can we extract from these experiences? Well, I think I've already mentioned this. When working in international teams, I think it's worthwhile the native English speakers learning some of the language, especially when working with local stakeholders in those non-English speaking countries. I would also include some activities at the start of any international, multidisciplinary project and continue those activities throughout. So those activities should be aimed at raising cultural awareness, whether that's between different regions, faiths, professions, disciplines, and so on. I think that's really important. And in multidisciplinary teams, again, don't assume that everyone has enough pre-existing knowledge of your own discipline to follow the conversation. This should be considered as part of those activities to raise cultural awareness. And connected with this, make sure that you explain any jargon that might be specific to your particular discipline. Even if you think people know what you mean, they may not speak up and say, actually, I'm not sure, can you explain? So just explain that from the outset and plan some activities near the beginning of the project to delve into the vocabulary of your discipline and try to come up with a shared vocabulary that everyone understands. Number 5, as natural scientists, we're not used to really examining the fundamental basis for the way that we think about our research and the subjects of our research. But especially when working with social scientists, I think it's helpful to talk about the kind of core underlying assumptions of your approach to research. In other words, the ontology and epistemology. And just thinking back to my PhD, which was this interdisciplinary project between hardcore physics of fluid mechanics and the sort of fuzzy world of ecology, so the Newtonian versus the Darwinian, to simplify things too much. This paper by Hart was a really important source for me at the time because it showed in black and white why it can be so challenging to work between two disciplines, in this case, physics and ecology, but also suggested what we might do to overcome some of the challenges. And this way of thinking actually helped me to understand what I needed to do to unite these two disciplines. And in fact, what we decided to do was to search for simple, falsifiable laws. So not great for the ecologists, a bit better for the physicists, but also do this at successive spatial scales and pair controlled experiments with these extensive fieldwork campaigns that satisfy the ecologist's view of the world, which is complexity reigns supreme and we can never get to the bottom of it. So that was our way of synthesizing these two disciplines in our interdisciplinary project. Number 6 of 7, don't worry, I'm nearly finished. The only really negative experiences I've had when doing research networking has been down to uncertainty actually about what will be published from the project and who will be co-author on those publications. So very simple recommendation, just to be clear about what will be published and who will work on which publication right at the beginning. And finally, inter and multidisciplinary research has been really rewarding for me, and it's helped to broaden my both professional and personal horizons, and I'm sure it can do the same for you. So don't forget to enjoy the journey, would be my take-home message. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Martin. It's so true what you're saying. There's so much detail in what you just presented there. And so many parallels of my own experiences, to be honest. So it's really quite interesting to be brought back to some of the issues that I faced in the past. Good. So there are a few things popping up in the chat. Bruno put something in. I put a few questions in as well. Again, I encourage everybody who's maybe too shy to put something in. Don't be shy. Just put something in. We've got at least another 10 minutes or so to engage a little bit about the things that were just presented to us. So I want to encourage Bruno maybe to ask his questions. Bruno, if you're prepared to open up your microphone and then just go ahead and because then you can direct it a little bit to where you want it, rather than me just reading out your question.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michael. Well, thanks guys for these two nice presentations. Beautiful. I think this really fits in the vision and the rationale of what YUFE really wants to go for. We have the north-south axis, which is really an added value. I do not know if there are currently networks from the north to the south of Europe that are really also aligning and strategically working together. So that's one of the, let's say, most important, let's say, reasons for BioYUFE. That's also the reason why we are trying to focus more on biodiversity in first instance, because you have this relationship between biodiversity, climate change, energy problems, water. There are many, many issues that can be solved and can be looked at from north to south. So I'm not sure if there are other clusters that are existing, but at least this has the ground to touch upon. Maybe my first question was on education. What is your vision on how education students, before they really become researchers, can be stimulated to align with this vision, north-south vision, and implementation on a European level? Do you think they are open, or what can we provide for them as a kind of set starting point to maybe then further create this research network? So I was wondering, what do you think can be the leverage of education in this context?
Would you like me to start, Michael?
Yeah, why not, Martin? Just kick off, and then Matthew can add his views.
Actually, I haven't thought about this question, Bruno, but it's a good one, because one thing I noticed working in different institutions around the world, especially in South America, they really involve students in the research from an early stage. And I think that's good for everyone. And so it kind of indoctrinates the students into our way of thinking as researchers from the start, and exposes them to the world of research. So it's not a very comprehensive answer by involving them in the research, and not having such this clear boundary between education and research in the first place.
I guess, I mean, at least at Essex, we strive to have research-led education, but although we are striving for that, it's still more that, this is what I do as a researcher, and look how great I am, and here are some of my papers, and this is what I want to do next. But are we equipping our students sufficiently for the challenges of working in these networks? And these networks may just be a network of 2 people sometimes, right? So this is where it starts. So I wonder whether there are some ideas. I don't know, in Bremen, are there any ideas of, you know, do you challenge your students in that way? Is that part of your education, Matthew?
I have to say, I'm too new to Bremen and teaching to really answer that question for our approach, because I have been here for a grand total of 1 semester of teaching. So I cannot answer, so I'm a bit too new to really answer that. I think it's a good question, what's the potential role of education in this? Because it might also be something that, like, I just noticed Christine posted a very relevant comment that I think is one of the challenges to me as well. In this, that might be part of the answer to something, if we really want to do something on kind of the BioYUFE scale, is maybe this tying education to it, because we are a lot of educators. The main thing I can think of to add to this is that one of the impressions I've gotten so far in my relatively brief time working as an educator is that I think it's this kind of, again, this kind of continental scale, this collaborative scale, is something that students are very keen to do. A lot of, like, the master's students I interact with, they're very keen to do research elsewhere. They're very keen to think about this larger scale. So I think it is something that students are very interested in. How do you facilitate that and actually incorporate students? That I don't know. There might be opportunities to, I mean, one of the challenges is I think some of these long-term research networks require stability, and students aren't around forever. I think that's one of the challenges we'll face. I think the potential to get education in there is a really good idea. I think it maybe has potential, but I think that would be one of the challenges we'd face, is this instability, because I could see something trying to create a heavily, you know, some student-run project, but then it'd have to be integrated into all the different systems. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where to go with it, but I think there's something there. It might not be easy to achieve, but yeah.
And maybe a follow-up question on this. You have, of course, education, you have stakeholders as well, which makes it more complex. As Martin pointed out, this becomes transdisciplinary. You're not only maybe working together over disciplines, but also including stakeholders or citizens or whatever. And also here, I think the challenge for YUFE being, having different stakeholders in different countries at different sites makes it even more complex, but maybe also interesting. Now, I was wondering what could be a trigger, a challenge for not only involving researchers, but also involving stakeholders. Can we think of challenges that really could align, let's say, the research groups on biodiversity, and how do we get that started? So that's what could be a spark to get that started. So that's an open question.
Yeah, I mean, these are really good questions again to you know, think about how can we get everybody who will be part of research networks in the future aligned to start thinking about what they need to do in terms of the preparation. And, you know, 2 of the things that came up repeatedly is communication. You know, Martin mentioned, you know, the need to understand the language, and that may mean already understand the language of somebody working in a different discipline, which is often a problem, although they speak this culturally the same language, understanding different cultures and all that. And I think this is a big struggle for us still, to be honest, because the expectations are so different. Christine just brought up another very large point. Christine, do you want to explain a little bit your point? What you're taking about, you know, how to define common project across disciplines within BioYUFE. That's an issue as well.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Thanks for great presentations. And sorry, I was a bit late. I got mixed up with the connection. But anyway, I found it really interesting to hear you speak from your field, which is quite different from mine, and come to similar or come to questions that speak to me, that whole question of interdisciplinarity, which anticipate the next webinar. It's interesting to see that you dealt with that question, started dealing with that question at this stage when talking about research networks. And I often feel like a fish out of water within BioYUFE, being, you know, in the humanities and literature and so on. But it's, in a way, it's, I don't know if it's reassuring, but it's interesting for me to see that within the, what I would call the field of biology, which is yours, there's also this question of sharing interests. What, you know, what projects can, as Matthew put it, be interesting to a wide range of people. So that's a big question. The way I can think about it in terms of where I come from is in terms of narrative, and I'm thinking of the one of the slides that Martin showed with the intersecting area in the middle, and what can be shared, what is common, and so on. So yeah, the link would be the narrative, but even that would be new to us, or different from what we used to do. So I think this question of networks and working together has to be creative in a way, and that came through in your presentations as well. But I'm not sure how to deal with that. So yeah, I don't have, you know, precise suggestions quite apart from. I still believe that it's got potential and that it would lead to interesting experiments or conclusion results, but I'm not sure how to go about it at this stage. So thank you for discussing this in your presentations.
All right, good. Let's move on to the next point. Maybe there's one point that was mentioned directly to me in a direct message, so it wasn't shared across to everybody. So I'm not going to reveal who asked this, but this person says, I was actually looking for any advice about reaching out to people in the field and best practices for beginning a research network between collaborators. Any guidance on that? Any advice? I mean, how did you go about with your DIY approaches? I've got a few examples I could rattle down, but I want to hear your views first. Matthew?
Yeah, sure. I don't know if I'm the best person to absolutely, you know, give the advice, because this is something I'm just starting now after a couple of years of organizing and applying for grants and finally getting started. So I cannot give you that much give anyone that much in the way of time-tested advice, let's say. I do think I mean, I will echo that communication is a big part of it. It takes time, you need to be able to prepare at that time. I still don't know if I've mastered the communication. There are still things that I should be talking about that I feel awkward about and things like that. But I do think communication is a really big part of it, especially from the DIY system. If you're doing it kind of on your own, meeting people, asking people, like a lot of how I've met. So not to feel awkward about contacting people. The worst thing that happens is, so the absolute worst thing that happened that's basically not going to happen is someone like replies to you as a real asshole, and then you just never talk to them again, and that's okay. There's more people, but that's never happened to me. Occasionally, yeah, maybe someone doesn't reply, and that's probably just because they got lost in an email. And usually people are really excited. Sometimes they'll say, no, I don't have time. But like when I've been, for example, for this project I've been planning, trying to find butterflies and things like that. When I've approached people, I've usually asked people like, can you suggest someone? So I've taken people I know, asked people, do you know people in these regions, and gotten a few suggestions. And when I approach people, people have generally been very happy. Now, I've also tried to make it so they're doing as little work as possible. Like this is kind of like, okay, I just need help with this and this, so come with a clear proposal. But so from that, I say like communication is definitely like the most important thing. Not being afraid to reach out to people, which I still sometimes am, but like that's again, generally people will be nice about it in my experience. And then I think the other thing is like giving yourself enough time to figure things out, again, because there are going to be bureaucratic complexities. most countries in Europe, the Nagoya Protocol isn't too much of a problem, but for some it does matter the kind of permits you'll need. Usually it's not too difficult, but some places it will be. But again, I think that's something that having this network really helps with, not having to do absolutely everything yourself. And again, and I think that's really where YUFE maybe has the easy potential to help with things, regardless of whether it's all kind of within the same discipline or someone's looking for interdisciplinary collaborators, is helping to make those get over that kind of hurdle and introduce yourself to people. And then being able to explain, being prepared to explain your idea, especially if you're doing it in more of this DIY way where you have an idea you want to test, being ready to explain that. And I think the part that I have not mastered yet and is really important is figuring out how to incorporate people into larger projects. I'm used to working more on my own, how to manage some of these things like authorship and different levels of involvement and expectations is something that I think is very important. I am absolutely not a master, so if people want to come and give me some advice, please do. Or ways to apply the advice. But that I think is another important part of it.
Good. No, this exactly also reflects my own experiences actually of working with research networks. It's exactly the same. Don't be afraid of approaching somebody. I guess it's not the worst for them not to respond to you. The worst is probably for them to say no, thank you. But typically everybody is curious and interested first. I think the biggest challenge that I find, and I'm currently, I would say, co-lead a DIY research network at the moment. The biggest challenge for me is to develop the trust so that people actually find, are comfortable with opening up and voicing all these concerns that they have, voicing the fact that they have no clue what this other person is going on about, to say like, I don't know, what is it you're talking here, right? So I think that's the biggest thing. And also the trust for them, for me as a leader of that team, to trust them that they tell me, now, Michael, now it's going wrong. Because sometimes I just feel like they're sitting there blank. Do they really understand where I want to take them? Do they really understand what we want to do? Or are they with me still? And it costs a lot of energy, as you said, even with these DIY ones, it costs a lot of energy to just build this up. And you need to be lucky and strike people that are passionate about it, that have the same passion for doing the sort of research that you're after. Good. I think we should come to an end because people are beginning to leave us and we are 6 minutes past the hour already. Christine says, okay, I hadn't heard of the concept of DIY research. Is this a term that is often used? No,
I literally just made it up for this presentation. I was thinking about like, what are the scenarios and kind of like, well, I'm doing this continental scale research, but I'm not doing it as part of a larger team. I was like, it's just kind of something I've been doing myself. And again, one of the approaches I've taken, because this has kind of been like my pet project, is it has been really like me trying to make it as simple as other people for the things of being involved. And just kind of things. But I think there's a really gradient of scales of how involved you can have that be. So no, it's just a term that I made up to try and explain what I was thinking about.
Good. And then Martin said that he needed to get back to his students. He said, one thing I wrote down listening to Christine was Mediterraneization of temperate systems. Could this be a research question to gather around? I guess Matthew probably with his research on insects, on butterflies, that would fit. I mean, it's a common theme. Is it too broad, Mediterraneization?
I mean, it depends. I think this is where if we want to really develop a more focused research network at some level within YUFE, I think it will be a big challenge because of the diversity. And it will, I think, finding not all of us, but a group of us who have some interactions. I think honestly, because we're so broad, taking more of an interdisciplinary approach, which is a challenge, but will probably be more productive, or be more effective because there is so much breadth within the group. It sounds potentially interesting, but I think also one of the challenges we'll face as YUFE is that we have lots of different expertises, but we don't have all expertises. And I mean, it's definitely a topic I've never really thought of before, but you could definitely start getting. No, again, I think a lot of it will be, if we really want to do something, there will be a lot of, it will either need someone with like a clear vision and leadership to like draw some subset of people in YUFE together, or it will take a lot of discussion and workshopping, or just like, it will take a lot of discussion and getting to know each other to figure out what are the places that we actually overlap where there might be something interesting. And I think it's something where you had the very early comment just about like an organized sampling day, and that'd be something that, you know, it'd be kind of nice because it'd be like a little bit more than just, you know, access facilitation, something you could do. But one of the questions with there would be, what is the purpose it's building towards? If it's just like, those things can be great for education or community engagement and things like that. But if you actually want to accumulate research with it, there is the question of what is this gauging for, especially if you want, what is it gauging for beyond what we can just do with, you know, something like GBIF for these databases. There's potentially things there. I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea, but I think it, one thing we want to think about it, and it could be something that's good just as a purely like, we're going to connect our universities in kind of an education and outreach way. But I think it's something that if we really want to take another step, we'd want to think about, is there a question we can relate it to? And again, I think one of the things that if we really want a network, we want it something that's for YUFE, we want it something that's interesting to people from a range of disciplines, which is not easy. Because as I think was really well pointed out by Martin's presentation, we have a lot of different epistemologies and ways of thinking things, and I mean, I guess we'll hear more about that, you know. We will hear more about that in the next symposium.
Yeah, that's right. Good. I think that is a good final line here, actually. Let me just reshare the advert for the next one. 3rd of June, 2024, same time. Third BioYUFE webinar on interdisciplinarity. Lilian Campos and Bruno Hoste going to talk us through that topic. So it fits quite nicely. I think we're coming to a natural finish line here, is I sense. So thanks very much, everybody, again, for joining us. Good to see you. Great conversation, some discussion as well. Really good. And yeah, we take all of these on board, I think. I mean, in summary, I think the two things that struck me the most is how can we prepare our students, maybe in a better way, to you know, think about research networks and how to assist them in building their own research networks. That's one thing. And then, you know, the problems about communication and cultural differences and all that have to be overcome. That's a you know, an endless problem. You know, are there particular techniques that we can envisage? And again, the interdisciplinarity webinar, maybe next time, can think about some of those techniques and how we can overcome those challenges. Thanks very much again, everybody. Good to see you. And I'm hoping to see you soon in a few weeks' time then. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Cheers.